Hello, viewer number 1931. What you're about to see might be treated as a threat. Whenever possible, notice, feel, and respond, instead of reacting in anger. You're watching Perception Culture. What pops into your mind when you hear the name Frankenstein? Is it a book, a movie, perhaps even a reference within another movie? Terror, pain, sympathy, confusion? Keep this starting point in mind and see how it evolves as we dig deep to dissect what animates Frankenstein.
It's alive! Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, was first published in 1818 and follows the story of Victor Frankenstein, a son from a wealthy family who, unable to deal with the grief of his mother's death, develops a technique to reanimate non-living matter. The creature he brings to life ends up being large and hideous, so Frankenstein flees, leaving the creature to fend for himself in a world not ready for its existence. Frankenstein is often referred to as the first science fiction novel due to its incorporation of galvanism in Frankenstein's science experiments, infusing elements from the Romantic movement and the Gothic novel. The author explores the pursuit of knowledge beyond accepted human limits, the characteristics of monstrosity, family ties and alienation, and the consequences of unbridled ambition. At the time of the novel's release, readers could only speculate on what inspired the story, as the identity of the book's author remained anonymous. It was only when the second edition was published in Paris in 1821 that it became public knowledge that the book was written by Mary Shelley. Her work received mixed reviews, with many praising the extraordinary tale and others dismissing it completely due to the author's disposition of not being a man. Sadly, the disbelief that Mary could create a story like Frankenstein would continue to echo in people's minds long after her death. A magazine article from 1968 even proclaimed, "In a case of truth being stranger than even strangest fiction, the author of Frankenstein was not only a girl, but a teenager." Luckily, the public's inability to believe that anyone other than a man could possess an imagination and writing skills did not stop the growing popularity of the book, and this led to the development of one of the earliest motion pictures that would be defined as a horror film, Frankenstein. Around the time of the movie's release, the film industry was in the process of going through some major technical and economical changes. The Great Depression dug a hole in the pockets of potential moviegoers, and the introduction of sound to previously silent pictures was changing the way audiences could enjoy a story. So, when cinema audiences first laid their eyes on Frankenstein in 1931, it provoked quite a reaction. Articles from the time report screenings where nurses were stationed in the theater lobbies to aid persons who might find the story of Frankenstein assembling a living being from body parts too nerve-wracking.
Well, the film itself, of course, was an enormous success.
However, there are many differences between the novel and the movie when it comes to the narrative. As one example, the film took liberties when it comes to the supporting characters, cutting many and adding some, such as Fritz, Frankenstein's assistant, who plays a big role in helping Frankenstein build his creature. Remarkably, the most noticeable difference between the novel and film lies in the creature himself. In the novel, Frankenstein's creature escapes, learns to survive in the wild, articulate his thoughts to others, and to read. At the end of the book, the creature recounts the story from his own perspective before heading off to unalive himself in a funeral pyre as a way to find peace. In the film, the creature had less dialogue. Boris Karloff, who played the character, has said this about his performance.
It was a great challenge and tremendously interesting, because here was a completely helpless, inarticulate, lumbering, helpless creature in a strange and hostile world without speech, and he had to communicate to people, and it was a challenge to find some way to do it.
Referred to as the monster in the movie, the creature's fate is a miserable one as he is set to blaze by an angry mob as he is hiding in a windmill with no way to escape. In the 113-year evolution from book to screen, the creature lost his voice, was characterized as monstrous rather than living, and was stripped of his ability to take responsibility for his actions. But why did this happen?
The brain that was stolen from my laboratory was a criminal brain.
In the movie, Fritz breaks into a nearby school that teaches anatomy in order to steal a healthy brain for Frankenstein's experiments, but accidentally damages it in the process and steals a brain that's dubbed abnormal or criminal instead. So let's consider, how can a brain be criminal? After all, isn't it merely an organ that serves as the center of the nervous system? A contraption of synapses and neurons that allows humans to respond to changes in their environment? What or who defines its intentions as criminal or abnormal? In Mary's book, you'll find an absence of the criminal brain. Instead, the creature is framed as innocent, brought into this world due to one man's unabridged ambition and left to defend itself as its creator abandons it. The creature does commit acts that harm others, but he does so from a place of deep hurt and alienation. Would the creature behave in a criminal manner if he had been welcomed and cared for by those around him? A nuanced story such as this will surely provoke differences of interpretation. A great example of this can be found in the case of the most controversial scene in Frankenstein, where the monster throws a little girl into a lake and drowns her. Even before it reached the eyes of film censors, it caused some differences of opinion on set, as Karloff explained in an interview. My conception of the scene was that he would look up at the little girl in bewilderment, and, in his mind, she would become a flower. Without moving, he would pick her up gently and put her in the water exactly as he had done to the flower, and, to his horror, she would sink. Well, Jimmy made me pick her up and do that over my head, which became a brutal and deliberate act. By no stretch of the imagination could you make that innocent. This scene, along with many others, became an eyesore for censors, already shortened during its release. The original film negative was recut after the strict reinforcement of the Hays Code in 1934, and the scene was removed until the 1980s when it was rediscovered in the British National Film Archive. The censors sensed with their non-criminal brains that this scene would cause controversy and eradicated it, much like the angry mob did with the creature at the end of the movie. But did this act really benefit audiences?
Now, a lot of authoritative people say that horror films have a bad effect on people, and some say they have a beneficial effect on people. Which do you agree with?
The word horror really implies revulsion, which isn't the idea of the exercise at all. It's entertainment, it's excitement, it's thrill, it's suspense. I don't know if they're beneficial. I don't think they do any harm. I can only speak of my own experience. When I played the monster, and I only played him 3 times in the first 3 films, any letters that I got from youngsters, beyond just asking for a photograph, all expressed great compassion for the monster, so I don't think it would be very harmful.
It can be a horrific experience to look within oneself and recognize qualities that societal norms deem monstrous. It can be horrifying to realize that your actions can have unintended consequences which lead to the suffering of others, and usually the first reaction to this type of realization will be to run and hide, much like Frankenstein and the creature did in Mary's book. But here lies the key to understanding the importance of stories such as Frankenstein. It gives the audience an opportunity to relate to the monster within and exercise compassion with the most abnormal brain of all, the heart. So, how are we able to move from shunning that which societal values define as criminal with our normal brains, to embracing connection with our abnormal one? We'll find out after these messages. This episode is brought to you by Frankie's last 2 brain cells. If these lone survivors sparked an interest in your imagination, subscribe to Compassion now. A monthly plan costs only $0, which is less than what you would have paid to see Frankenstein in theaters in 1931. Get yours now while stocks last.
Now I know what it feels like to be gone.
Scientists describe that the biggest differences between humans and animals are: 1. The ability to imagine, reflect on, and embed alternative situations into larger narratives of related events, and 2. The capacity to connect and exchange thoughts with others. However, as we have discussed, these are not skills that are always utilized. Are humans really more inclined to alienate those who are labeled as a threat or horrific? And is it natural for humans to choose the immoral conclusion to a moral dilemma? Well, it turns out this might not be the case. Neuroscientists have found that when humans put the needs of others before their own desires, their generosity activates the same part of the brain that responds to food and sex. This suggests that acting with kindness is biologically hardwired and even pleasurable to the brain. Guillermo del Toro, who is in pre-production on an adaptation of Frankenstein at the time this episode is being generated, provides insight on how noticing your reactions to horror can be used as a tool to connect to yourself.
There's a simple rule that I found to be true after 58 years in this world. Hatred and fear are mirrors. Love is windows. Every time you hate somebody, it's a mirror. Every time you fear somebody, it's a mirror. When you love somebody, they're a window to an entire world you don't know. You pour yourself into them, and everything is eradicated, the differences, which are all illusions, right? So horror allows you to recognize you. This is you. Horror is very healing in that it tells you there is a whole side they don't tell you about in life.
In a 1969 interview in Castle of Frankenstein magazine, Boris Karloff highlights how young audiences connected to a side of Frankenstein the movie didn't explicitly tell them about. Perhaps the best possible audience for a horror film is a child audience. The vivid imagination with which a child is gifted is far more receptive to the ingredients in these pictures than the adult imagination which merely finds them artificial. When I played Frankenstein's monster, I received sackloads of fan mail, mostly from young girls. These children had seen right through the makeup and had been deeply moved by sympathy for the poor brute. So, these young Frankenstein fans show us how childlike curiosity and imagination serve as a path to compassion, and this process involves three elements: noticing, feeling, and responding. This makes compassion something you enact, and implies that it is a practice, a skill, a habit that is possible to cultivate. So why is it important, and how do we practice compassion? To answer these questions, let's dig into some history. When Frankenstein's monster was first released into the cinematic world, there was a different type of movement in the US gathering strength. That's right, let's briefly touch on the eugenics movement as brought to you by the US of A. Eugenics, or a fringe set of beliefs and practices which aim to improve the genetic quality of a population, wasn't new in the US at this time. Between 1870 and 1920, there was massive immigration into the US. Within the span of these 50 years, there were 24 million immigrants who arrived in the country, many of whom were Jewish people, many of whom came from Eastern Europe, South America, and Asia, and many of whom were from rural areas and did not speak English.
So this massive influx of immigrants is proving unsettling, especially to people who are worried about maintaining their own superiority and control over the American political system and cultural institutions.
So what to do when you need to maintain control? You define, you educate, and you implement procedures. Eugenicists tied their ideas, which were rooted in racism, classism, ableism, and sexism, to the notion of public health and began to introduce their concepts to the general public at county, state, and even world fairs in the form of exhibits and interactive infographics.
And this light flashes every 7.5 minutes. Every 7.5 minutes, a high-grade person is born in the United States who will have the ability to do creative work and be fit for leadership. And just to satisfy your curiosity, how many are there? About 4% of all Americans come within this class. Okay, so you've got these blinking lights, this kind of information being compared. And then, of course, the motto, some people are born to be a burden on the rest. Who are they? Who are these degenerates? Paupers, poor people, beggars, thieves, criminals, prostitutes. My favorite category, wanderers. Most of them are, what's that word? Feeble-minded.
Perhaps you are able to notice some similarities in this framing with how Karloff's monster is depicted. In a case of truth being stranger than even strangest fiction, the director of Frankenstein was not only an immigrant, but one of the first openly gay directors in Hollywood.
By the time we are in the, starting the third decade of the 20th century, sterilization, coerced sterilization, not voluntary sterilization, is becoming the law of the land in many states. Now, why do these exhibits matter so much? And why do we need to talk about eugenics as something, not just as a sort of odd movement by people who are somehow seem to be fanatical and have this preoccupation with feeble-mindedness and degeneracy? The main reason we need to talk about them is because their ideas, their exhibits, their literature had consequences, huge consequences, legislative consequences.
A real-life consequence of these practices was that 60,000 people, most of whom were women of color, homosexuals, poor people, or neurodivergent, were sterilized in the U.S. between 1909 and 1960. This is just one of many instances in life where lack of acceptance of differences has led to death and suffering. It is not enough to make and control life as Frankenstein set out to do. It is elementary to care for what is already alive. Every creature will be able to relate to the suffering that comes from alienation in some form or another. A fictional monster merely serves as a symbolic representation of those worries, and audiences can and will relate when given the chance. After all, a big chunk of Universal Pictures' business was made up by monsters who brought audiences into theaters for many decades, and it is Karloff himself who reveals how far a single spark of this type of connection will take you.
The monster turned out to be the best friend I ever had. He changed the whole course of my life. I was an obscure and struggling, unknown actor. Then all of a sudden I get this marvelous opportunity handed to me with all the help and assistance that I could ask for. And in my career, my work hasn't stopped since.
After all this, why not exercise our newly found brain? Are you ready? To Mary Shelley, whose work was discounted for decades due to whom she was born as, may you be held in compassion. To those who deny nuance in earthly existence for personal gain, may your pain and sorrow be eased. And to every creature out there who feels discarded by the world, may your heart be at peace.
What I love about horror is it brings the world to you. And horror is a shrine to imperfection and tells you it's okay to be a monster. We are all monsters at the end of the day. Can we live with that?
So, to give the monster in you new life, repeat after me. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous. May I be held in compassion. May my pain and sorrow be eased. May I be at peace. This program thanks you for your sustained attention. Like, comment, and subscribe to.
The soul of the film is about a representation in itself.